natural law is something that has been around for a long time. Since the Middle Ages, there's different variants of it. You could see the doctrine of natural rights that was prominent in the 18th century, out of which Jefferson's Declaration came, as part of the natural law tradition. But there are different natural law traditions as well, some of which are associated specifically with Roman Catholic moral theology, with the thought of Thomas Aquinas and others since then. So let me say a few things about this, because it's an important moral tradition that is certainly one that is distinct from the consequentialist or utilitarian tradition we talked about last time. So essentially what the natural law ethic is saying is that moral law can be derived from our human nature, and we should not act against our human nature. So the first point to think about, if you've ever heard the term natural law ethic and you haven't studied it philosophically, many people assume that it's talking about a distinction between what is natural and what is artificial. And that view is often bolstered by the fact that, as I said, the natural law tradition is strong in Catholic theology, and we all know that Catholic moral teaching says that you should not use the contraceptive pill, but you may use something that's usually known as the rhythm method to be aware of the time in a woman's cycle when she is most likely to conceive, and to avoid having sex during that period. So a lot of people think, well, the pill is something artificial, it's something that chemists make in a lab, whereas just knowing when a woman is more likely to be fertile or not and avoiding having sex during that period, there's nothing artificial going on. There's no chemicals involved. It's natural in that sense. Well, that is a mistake, both as an understanding of why the Catholic Church says you should not use the contraceptive pill, and as an understanding of what natural law is about. It's not about the distinction between what's natural and artificial in that sense. If it were, obviously, it would have a huge range of ramifications that you never hear the Catholic Church talking about. You never hear the Catholic leaders saying, you should not eat any food that's been artificially coloured. You should only eat food that retains its natural colouring. Right? But if we're talking about avoiding things that are artificial, that would be an implication of that doctrine. So what is going on in that particular teaching and in natural law ideas? It's somewhat complicated, but essentially the idea is that we have a sexual nature, we have reproductive organs, and they exist for some sort of purpose. They have a nature. We have a nature as a result of having those organs, which is reproductive. And therefore, we should never act intentionally against that reproductive aspect of our nature. So if we take the contraceptive pill or if we use a condom, we are blocking the function of those reproductive capacities that we have, reproductive nature. Now, you might say, well, you could understand that perhaps, whether you agree with it or not is a different question, but you could understand it. But then why isn't consulting a calendar to find out when a woman is likely to be fertile equally acting against your reproductive nature? And that's, I think, actually a more difficult question for the defender of the Catholic view to answer. And what they can say is, well, you're not engaging in a contraceptive act. You're not engaging in an act that blocks the reproductive function of your organs. What you're doing is omitting to take part in an act. That is, you're omitting to have sex during a certain number of days when a woman is most likely to conceive. And so there's a distinction here between acts and omissions, which again is something that we're going to talk about in the context of medical ethics and whether that's defensible. But something like that is going on. There's no intentional blocking in quite the same way. So I use that example really just in order to illustrate what's going on in natural law theory, the way in which it's trying to say, we ought to act according to our nature, and our nature is such that we have sexual desires for reproductive purposes. Even given that understanding of the view, there are still a number of things that one might say that are critical of it. One is do we want to accept in general the principle that it's good to follow our nature? If you want to consider whether we ought to accept that principle in general, then one question that you have to ask is, what if our nature were very different? What if our nature were cruel? And that's, in this case, not really, unfortunately, a particularly peculiar or bizarre hypothesis. We can interpret the actual human nature we see before us in various ways, but it does seem that at least some human beings are cruel by nature. They seem to gratuitously inflict suffering on beings in their power. So it's perhaps arguable that this actually is a tendency in the nature of many or most human beings. And even if you don't want to accept as gloomy a claim as that, we could certainly easily imagine that we did consist mainly or entirely of people who did have that propensity to be cruel to beings who were powerless and on whom they could inflict suffering. And if that were so, it seems really hard to accept the idea that it would be good to act in accordance with our nature. So what that suggests is that this account here really appeals to people only if they have a positive view of human nature, only if they think that our real nature, our true nature, is to be social beings who are generally kind to others, generally wish to help others, and act for good purposes. But can we really defend that view? Well, is the question, are we trying to look at human nature and say, look, let's try and do all kinds of scientific observations and studies and experiments and tests, and let's see how human nature comes out, and then however human nature does turn out to be, the right thing to do will be to act in accordance with that nature. Or are we, as I suggest in the last line, already starting out with a positive moral view of human nature, so that when anybody does a study and says, let's say, well, think about Stanley Milgram's famous experiment where he showed that most people, when told by a person they believe to be a scientist wearing a white coat, tells them to inflict electric shock on somebody who fails to answer certain questions correctly, most people will go ahead and administer electric shock, even up to the point where the person is begging them to stop. So some people will say, well, yes, but that's the circumstances and their upbringing that has led them to be so obedient to authority and to do what people in white coats tell them to do. And that's not really human nature. Human nature has been corrupted at that point. So that's something that many people are likely to say who are wanting to defend the view that the right thing to do is what's in accordance with our nature. When you present them with counterexamples where doing what seems to be in accordance with our nature isn't good, isn't going to lead to good consequences, they'll say, that's not really human nature, that's only a kind of corrupted variant of our nature, corrupted by something in our upbringing or in our environment that has led people to behave in that way. But why should we assume that the positive aspects of human nature are the things that are natural to us, if you like, and the negative things are the result of society or upbringing or advertising or whatever you want to blame it on? you would really need to do a more impartial investigation of what human nature is like, and then it might not turn out to be as good as you thought. So I think there's lots of problems. I guess what I've been suggesting is that at different levels, there's different problems about this kind of view.